want to give you a daisy and some daisy seeds. Daisies are a symbol of clean air. Now, we're out to start clearing the air, and we hope you'll join in by putting this daisy on your car and lead-free Amoco anti-pollution gasoline in your tank.
At the end of the 19th century, most American homes did not run on electricity. Nights were lit by kerosene lamps. Factories relied on oil to keep machines from grinding themselves apart. Railroads depended on oil to reduce friction, heat, and wear across thousands of miles of moving metal. Long before cars or gasoline stations existed, oil had already become a quiet foundation of daily life. The problem was not lack of oil, it was disorder. In the decades after the first major discoveries in Pennsylvania, oil production expanded faster than any system could contain it. Wells were drilled wherever land and capital allowed. Refineries appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. There were no common standards, no stable pricing, and no long-term planning. Prices collapsed without warning, surged again, then collapsed once more. Entire fortunes were made and lost in a single year. Refining was dangerous and inefficient. Fires were frequent. Storage was improvised. Large amounts of crude oil were spilled or burned because there was no way to handle excess supply. Only kerosene was considered valuable. Gasoline, which would later dominate energy markets, was treated as a useless and volatile byproduct and often discarded. Quality varied wildly. One batch of refined oil might burn clean. Another might explode. This instability hurt nearly everyone involved. Producers could not predict income. Refiners could not plan output. Railroads could not rely on consistent shipments. Cities depended on kerosene for light, but had no assurance that supply or price would remain steady. The oil industry was growing rapidly, but it was growing in a form that could not sustain itself. This is the environment in which John D. Rockefeller emerges, not as an inventor or explorer, but as an organizer. Rockefeller did not focus on drilling. He focused on refining, the point where crude oil became usable. While many operators chased rapid expansion, Rockefeller concentrated on process. His refineries emphasized standardization, cost control, and waste reduction. Byproducts others discarded were reused or sold. Equipment was upgraded deliberately. Operations were measured and repeated until variation was minimized. These choices mattered most during downturns. When prices collapsed, smaller refineries failed. Rockefeller's operations survived because their costs were lower and their processes more stable. Instead of competing through constant expansion, Rockefeller waited. When competitors collapsed under volatility, he bought their refineries cheaply. Growth occurred quietly through absorption rather than confrontation. Transportation amplified this advantage. Oil moved primarily by rail, and railroads faced their own pressures. Empty rail cars and unpredictable shipments were costly. What railroads valued most was not high prices per barrel, but steady volume. Rockefeller understood this leverage. He offered consistent, high-volume shipments in exchange for lower rates. These rebates were legal at the time, but they reshaped the market. Lower transportation costs allowed Rockefeller to sell oil cheaper than competitors while maintaining profit. During price wars, Standard Oil could continue operating while others bled cash. The cycle reinforced itself. Scale produced stability. Stability attracted railroads. Railroad preference reinforced scale. As this system expanded, Standard Oil did not need to dominate publicly. It became the most reliable participant in a chaotic market. Refiners who could not compete sold willingly rather than fail outright. Railroads structured routes around Standard Oil's volume. Cities came to depend on its output without recognizing how centralized supply had become. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled the majority of American oil refining, not because it owned every well, but because it controlled the processes and pathways that made oil usable and movable. Prices became more stable. Supply became predictable. For consumers, this felt like progress. There were no uniforms, no company towns, no visible enforcement. Kerosene became cheaper. Homes became brighter. Industry ran with fewer interruptions. To most Americans, Standard Oil did not look like a monopoly. It looked like order imposed on chaos. That perception delayed resistance. Politicians struggled to explain why a company that lowered prices and stabilized supply should be challenged. Consumers did not feel exploited. Even competitors often chose absorption over continued instability. But beneath that order, something new was forming. Control that did not rely on law or force, but on infrastructure. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It was becoming a system, and that system was increasingly shaped by a single company. By the time questions began forming about how much influence one company should hold, Standard Oil was no longer simply operating within the market. It was organizing the market itself. And systems that quietly shape daily life are always hardest to confront once they are already everywhere. The way Standard Oil operated during this phase was not obvious, because it aligned with how Americans already understood progress. Bigger factories meant cheaper goods. Better organization meant fewer shortages. In an era defined by instability, predictability itself felt like innovation. Rockefeller did not need public support or political protection at this stage. The system rewarded him naturally. What made this rise especially durable was that it did not depend on any single breakthrough. There was no moment where Standard Oil suddenly took control. Its influence accumulated through hundreds of small advantages layered over time: slightly lower costs, slightly better logistics, slightly more reliable output. Each advantage looked minor on its own. Together, they reshaped the market. Competitors who failed were not always poorly run. Many were simply exposed to volatility Rockefeller had insulated himself against. When prices collapsed, they lacked the reserves to continue operating. When transport costs spiked, they had no leverage to negotiate. Rockefeller's model absorbed shocks that destroyed others, not because it was aggressive, but because it was prepared. This created a quiet shift in behavior across the industry. Independent refiners began planning their businesses around Standard Oil's pricing. Railroads adjusted schedules and capacity to match its volume. Retail distributors aligned contracts to its output. Without formal authority, Standard Oil became the reference point against which decisions were made. As this dependence deepened, choice narrowed. Alternatives existed in theory, but not in practice. The market still looked competitive on paper, yet outcomes increasingly flowed through one dominant structure. This is how Standard Oil gained power without ever needing to announce it. By the time oil's importance began expanding beyond lighting into new uses, the foundation was already set. The company had positioned itself not just to supply oil, but to shape how oil moved, how it was priced, and who could survive within the system. That positioning would become far more consequential as oil moved from a household utility to a strategic resource. What followed was not a sudden change, but a gradual tightening. The same mechanisms that had stabilized the market now began limiting entry. The same efficiencies that lowered prices began concentrating influence. Standard Oil was still solving problems, but it was also defining the boundaries within which everyone else had to operate. By the time Standard Oil became the most reliable player in the oil market, its influence no longer depended on size alone. What gave the company real power was the way it positioned itself inside systems other companies could not avoid. Standard Oil did not need to announce dominance. It made itself essential. The most important system was transportation. Oil had little value if it could not move cheaply and consistently. Railroads controlled that movement, but railroads themselves were under pressure. Tracks were expensive to maintain. Empty rail cars meant losses. Inconsistent shipments made scheduling difficult. What railroad executives wanted above all was predictability. Standard Oil offered exactly that. It promised steady, high-volume shipments over long periods of time. In exchange, it negotiated lower shipping rates. These agreements, known as rebates, were legal during the late 19th century and widely used across industries. What made Standard Oil different was scale. Its volume allowed it to secure discounts competitors could never match. Lower transport costs changed everything. Standard Oil could sell refined oil at prices that squeezed smaller refiners without eliminating profit. During downturns, it could afford to operate at margins others could not survive. This was not a temporary advantage, it was structural. Competitors faced a narrowing set of choices. They could continue operating and risk collapse during the next price swing, or they could sell. Many chose to sell. Acquisitions were often framed as rational exits rather than defeats. Rockefeller did not need to crush rivals publicly. Market conditions did the work. As Standard Oil expanded, it faced a new problem. Managing dozens of refineries across multiple states was inefficient under traditional ownership structures. Laws restricted corporations from operating freely across state lines. Rockefeller's solution was the trust. Under the trust system, shareholders of different companies transferred their stock to a small group of trustees in exchange for trust certificates. Control was centralized without formal mergers. On paper, companies remained separate. In practice, decisions were unified. This structure allowed Standard Oil to coordinate pricing, production, and expansion without appearing as a single monolithic corporation. It also shielded internal strategy from public scrutiny. Operations could be optimized quietly. The trust did not exist to dominate consumers. Its primary purpose was coordination. Refineries no longer competed against one another destructively. Output was adjusted to match demand. Price wars became rare. From the perspective of railroads, retailers, and cities, this brought stability. That stability had consequences. Independent refiners found it increasingly difficult to survive outside the trust. Even when alternatives existed, they lacked the efficiency and access Standard Oil enjoyed. Over time, the market became dependent on Standard Oil's coordination to function smoothly. What made this dependence difficult to challenge was that it produced visible benefits. Kerosene prices declined, supply interruptions decreased, fires and waste were reduced. For consumers, life improved. There was no obvious harm demanding immediate correction. Politicians struggled to frame opposition. Traditional monopolies raised prices. Standard Oil lowered them. Traditional cartels restricted supply. Standard Oil stabilized it. The usual arguments against concentration did not apply cleanly. Meanwhile, Standard Oil extended its influence beyond refining. It invested in pipelines to reduce reliance on railroads where possible. It controlled storage facilities. It influenced export channels. Each move reduced vulnerability and increased leverage. These decisions were not ideological. They were defensive. Rockefeller believed coordination prevented chaos. Competition, in his view, wasted resources. Stability preserved value. His system rewarded discipline and punished volatility. As the oil industry matured, Standard Oil's role shifted further. It became the reference point for pricing, capacity, and investment. New entrants measured themselves against it. Railroads adjusted contracts around it. Retailers aligned supply with its output. This was control without commands. No laws were passed. No force was used. The market reorganized itself around the most efficient structure available. By the late 1890s, Standard Oil no longer needed to acquire competitors aggressively. Its dominance was embedded. Alternatives existed, but they operated at the margins. The trust had become the framework within which the industry functioned. This framework, however, attracted attention. Journalists, reformers, and politicians began questioning whether efficiency justified concentration. Investigations examined secret rebates, coordinated pricing, and the opaque trust structure. Public perception began to shift. What had once looked like order started to look like exclusion. Stability began to resemble control. The same coordination that reduced chaos now appeared to limit opportunity. The debate was no longer about oil prices. It was about power. Who should be allowed to organize essential systems? Whether private efficiency could justify public dependence. These questions did not arise because Standard Oil failed, but because it succeeded too completely. As scrutiny intensified, the trust structure that had allowed Standard Oil to operate quietly became a liability. Laws that once tolerated coordination now targeted it. What had been invisible was becoming visible. The system Rockefeller built had solved the chaos of early oil. It had also concentrated influence to a degree that made political response inevitable. The next phase of Standard Oil's story would not be shaped by markets alone, but by law. Another layer of Standard Oil's control came from information. Because it operated across so many refineries, regions, and transport routes, It accumulated data competitors simply did not have. It knew which markets were oversupplied, which rail lines were congested, which regions could absorb price changes without reducing demand. Smaller refiners worked almost blindly by comparison, reacting to price signals after damage was already done. This informational advantage allowed Standard Oil to time its decisions with precision. Production could be increased where demand was rising and quietly reduced where prices were weakening. Storage facilities were used strategically, holding oil off the market during gluts and releasing it during shortages. These moves did not require public announcements. They shaped outcomes invisibly. Standard Oil also benefited from vertical coordination. It did not rely solely on independent suppliers or distributors. By extending control over pipelines, storage tanks, and export terminals, it reduced exposure to external shocks. Each added layer narrowed the space where competitors could operate freely. The company did not meet exclusivity agreements everywhere. Its presence alone altered incentives. This coordination created a reinforcing loop. Because Standard Oil was reliable, banks viewed it as safer. Because financing was cheaper, expansion was easier, reliability increased. Smaller refiners faced the opposite cycle. Higher risk meant higher borrowing costs, which limited investment and increased vulnerability during downturns. Over time, this imbalance changed how failure occurred in the oil industry. Companies no longer failed suddenly from single bad decisions. They failed slowly, squeezed between stable pricing they could not match and transport costs they could not escape. Selling to Standard Oil became the least damaging option. Public criticism lagged behind these developments because their effects were indirect. There were no dramatic shortages or price spikes to trigger outrage. Instead, the industry became quieter. Fewer independent voices, fewer visible experiments, less variation. What remained was smooth operation, which many mistook for health. This quieting of the market worried reformers, who believed competition itself was a public good. Journalists began documenting how rebates worked in practice and how trust coordination limited entry. Court cases tested whether these arrangements violated emerging antitrust principles. Standard Oil's defense rested on results. Prices were lower than before. Waste was reduced. Supply was steady. From the company's perspective, the system worked. From critics' perspective, it worked too well, concentrating decisions that affected millions into the hands of a few trustees. As these debates intensified, the trust structure that once seemed like an internal efficiency tool became a public symbol of overreach. What had been invisible coordination was now interpreted as deliberate consolidation. The same mechanisms that had protected the industry from chaos were reframed as mechanisms of control. The market had reorganized itself around Standard Oil's logic. Undoing that logic would not be simple. Breaking the company apart would not automatically recreate competition. The systems it had built would outlast the legal structure that contained them. These questions set the stage for the most consequential confrontation in the company's history, one that would move Standard Oil's fate out of boardrooms and into the Supreme Court, forcing the country to decide whether efficiency alone could justify this level of private coordination. By the time lawmakers seriously turned their attention towards Standard Oil, the company had already reshaped how oil worked in America. The argument was no longer only about what a gallon of kerosene cost. It was about concentration inside a sector that had become essential to daily life. Reformers feared that one organization now influenced refining, transportation, storage, and investment decisions across an industry that cities depended on to function. The legal tool for challenging that concentration was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. At first, the law was unevenly enforced and poorly defined. Trusts remained common, and many courts treated coordination as a normal part of doing business. But by the early 1900s, the political mood shifted. Public pressure increased. Investigative reporting made the mechanics of trusts easier to explain, and Standard Oil became the clearest symbol of the question America was trying to answer. Should any private company be allowed to organize an entire essential system? The case against Standard Oil was built around behavior more than pricing. Prosecutors argued that the trust structure enabled coordinated decisions that suppressed competition even when consumer prices looked reasonable. The issue was not simply whether Standard Oil had made kerosene cheaper. It was whether rivals could enter, survive, and expand in a market where transportation deals, coordination, and infrastructure advantages could be directed from a single center. Standard Oil's defense leaned heavily on outcomes. It argued that coordination had stabilized a chaotic market, reduced waste, and delivered consistent supply at lower prices. From the company's perspective, organization was not abuse, it was efficiency. Rockefeller's side framed the trust as a rational response to volatility, insisting that breaking it apart would revive the disorder that once made the industry dangerous and unreliable. The courts were forced to evaluate something larger than a single merger. They were evaluating a system. The trust model unified many nominally separate companies under one decision-making structure, allowing pricing, output, and expansion to be managed as a single operation. The question became whether this type of coordination represented an unreasonable restraint of trade. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. It found that the company had violated antitrust law and ordered the trust dissolved. The ruling required Standard Oil to be separated into multiple independent companies. On paper, the decision looked final. The largest and most famous trust in America was being broken apart by law. The public narrative treated this as a clean victory. The trust was gone, so competition would return. But the breakup did not erase what had been built. It redistributed it. The successor companies did not begin as small entrants learning the business from scratch. They inherited refineries, pipelines, terminals, storage facilities, distribution relationships, and experienced management. They inherited the operational discipline and market knowledge developed under centralized coordination. The court could dissolve legal ownership structures, but it could not dissolve infrastructure. This mattered because oil was already a scale business. Moving crude cheaply required expensive networks. Refining required large facilities and technical expertise. Distribution depended on storage and transport nodes positioned for efficiency. These realities created high barriers for new entrants. After the breakup, those barriers did not fall. The largest pieces of Standard Oil simply became the most advantaged new companies in the market. Former Standard Oil entities also carried a shared logic. The practices that had been standardized under the trust continued because they worked. Disciplined cost control, careful expansion, and coordinated thinking about transport and storage. Even if the companies were now legally separate, they were shaped by the same origin and the same methods. Financial markets reinforced the continuity. Investors who had profited from the trust retained stakes across the successor firms. Executive talent and institutional knowledge did not vanish. The breakup changed the legal map, but it did not reset the playing field. In some respects, the outcome widened American oil influence. Multiple large companies replaced one dominant trust, and these firms expanded aggressively. The concentration became less visible because it was no longer housed in a single corporate name, but the industry remained dominated by large, sophisticated players with inherited advantages. For regulators, this exposed a limitation of antitrust in infrastructure-heavy sectors. Breaking up a company could change ownership without changing the structural forces that favored scale. The systems Standard Oil built, transport routes, storage strategy, refining discipline, investment logic, continued shaping behavior after the legal structure was dismantled. Standard Oil as a single entity was gone, but its framework survived. The industry that emerged after 1911 was not a return to the chaotic competition of the 1870s. It was a new environment where several powerful firms operated within boundaries shaped by decades of centralized organization. That is why the breakup became both a warning and a lesson. It proved the government could challenge a corporation publicly, but it also showed how difficult it was to undo power once it had been embedded into infrastructure, capital networks, and operating habits. Changing a name did not automatically recreate a market, it changed the shape of control. And with oil's importance growing beyond lighting into broader industrial and strategic uses, the question was no longer just whether Standard Oil had been broken up. It was whether the system it created had made concentration the default state of energy itself. One consequence of this continuity was how quietly power shifted rather than disappeared. The successor companies inherited regional dominance almost by default. Former Standard Oil firms controlled refining in specific areas, transport corridors, and access points to major markets. New competitors entering the industry faced a landscape already optimized for large operators. The rules had changed on paper, but the terrain had not. This mattered because oil was no longer just a commercial product. It was becoming strategic. Industrial expansion, naval power, and emerging motorized transport all depended on reliable fuel supply. The companies that emerged from Standard Oil's breakup were positioned to serve these needs immediately, without the delays and failures that had once characterized early oil markets. As demand expanded, the advantages inherited from the trust period compounded. Access to capital remained easier for established firms. Technical expertise accumulated faster where operations were already large and complex. Smaller firms survived at the margins, but the center of gravity stayed with the descendants of Standard Oil. The breakup, therefore, achieved something narrower than many expected. It removed a single symbol of concentration, but it did not dismantle the industrial logic that favored coordination, scale, and long-term planning. That logic continued guiding decisions long after the trust itself ceased to exist.